For the 13,000 exhausted Marines clinging to a patch of mud and coral called Guadalcanal, silence was the sound of dread. It was the unnerving quiet before the daily bombing raid, the breathless pause before the nightly naval bombardment. But in the pre-dawn darkness of September 14, 1942, a different kind of quiet had fallen over a small, grassy ridge just south of the main airfield. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of desperation. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion, under the command of the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, was on the verge of breaking. For 2 nights, they had been battered by waves of elite Japanese soldiers. Now their lines were paper-thin. The fate of the entire American position on Guadalcanal, and perhaps the entire Pacific War, rested on this single, anonymous slope of land. Inside a command bunker, a battered Marine officer, his face streaked with grime and fatigue, pointed a trembling finger at a crude, hand-drawn map. He was speaking to an Army Air Forces captain named John Thompson. But the Marine wasn't asking for fighters to clear the skies. He wasn't asking for high-altitude interception. He was asking for something far stranger. He was asking for flying artillery. He needed pilots who could fly so low they could see the enemy's faces. Pilots who could place cannon shells and machine gun fire directly into the Japanese formations, massing for the final, decisive push. The machine Captain Thompson had at his disposal was the Bell P-400 Airacobra, a fighter plane already infamous across the Allied world as a complete and utter failure. It was a plane so despised, so fundamentally flawed, that its own pilots had nicknamed their missions fleeing. Now, in the most critical hour of the Pacific campaign, the Marines weren't just asking for help from this failed aircraft. They were betting the entire island on it. The P-400 Airacobra is remembered today, if it is remembered at all, as one of World War II's great aviation disappointments. A cautionary tale of a promising design that simply couldn't perform. But that accepted history is wrong. The truth, hidden in the mud and blood of Guadalcanal, is far more complex. The very design flaws that made the Airacobra a catastrophic failure as a high-altitude fighter were the exact, unique characteristics that transformed it into the unlikely savior of Edson's Ridge. This is the story of how the wrong plane, in the right hands, at the wrong time, became the perfect weapon, proving that in the crucible of war, victory doesn't always go to the best technology, but to the most brutally effective application of what you have. To understand the myth of the Airacobra, we must first understand the world that created it. In the late 1930s, aviation design was in a state of revolutionary fervor. The dominant theory, the one pursued by Britain's Spitfire and Germany's Messerschmitt, was that a fighter's heart was its engine, and its teeth were machine guns mounted in the wings. Bell Aircraft, a smaller American company, decided to challenge this orthodoxy. They imagined a different kind of killer. Their idea was to build an aircraft not around its engine, but around a cannon. A massive, hard-hitting 37mm cannon, firing through the propeller hub itself. It was a concept more akin to a flying tank than a nimble dogfighter. To achieve this, they had to solve a fundamental engineering problem: where to put the engine. Their solution was radical. They placed the Allison V-12 engine behind the pilot, in the middle of the fuselage, connecting it to the propeller via a 10-foot-long drive shaft that ran directly between the pilot's feet. This bizarre mid-engine layout gave the Airacobra its distinctive, almost reptilian profile. It also gave it a tricycle landing gear, making it exceptionally stable on the ground. On paper, it was a world-beater, heavily armed, futuristic, and sleek. The Royal Air Force, desperate for any modern fighter in 1940, ordered hundreds of them under the Lend-Lease program. They designated their version the P-400. The planes arrived in Britain, and the RAF's top pilots took them up. The verdict was swift, and it was brutal. The Airacobra had a fatal, unforgivable flaw. For reasons of cost and production expediency, Bell had omitted a crucial piece of technology, a high-altitude supercharger. A supercharger acts like a lung for an engine, forcing more air into the cylinders to compensate for the thin atmosphere at high altitude. Without an effective one, the Allison engine began to gasp for air above 12,000 feet. Its performance plummeted catastrophically. The air war over Europe was being fought at 20,000, 25,000, even 30,000 feet. A fighter that couldn't fight above 3 miles high was not a fighter. It was a death trap. The British rejected them outright, calling them nearly useless. The name Airacobra became a joke in RAF mess halls. The planes, already painted in British camouflage, were sent back. And the U.S. Army Air Forces, reeling from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and desperately short of any modern aircraft, took them. They didn't even bother to repaint them. They just slapped an American star over the British roundel and shipped them out to the one theater where they thought they might do some good, the far-flung, desperate battlegrounds of the Pacific. This is where the men of the 67th Pursuit Squadron enter the story. Stationed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they were the definition of a peacetime unit thrown into a global war. They were understrength, flying obsolete Seversky P-35s, aircraft that were already museum pieces. Most of their pilots were fresh out of flight school, barely qualified, held together by the quiet competence of leaders like Dale D.D. Brannan and the charismatic John A. Thompson. They were told to pack their bags for overseas deployment, with no idea where they were going or what they would be flying. On January 23, 1942, they sailed from Brooklyn aboard a converted passenger liner. The 5-week voyage was a miserable introduction to the realities of war. Overcrowded, poorly supplied, with each man rationed to a single canteen of water per day for drinking, washing, and shaving. They were sailing towards a collapsing world. Guam and Wake Island had fallen. The Philippines were locked in a desperate, losing battle. America was on the run, trying to establish a defensive perimeter from Hawaii to Australia. The 67th was a tiny, insignificant plug being sent to fill a massive hole in that line. After a stop in Australia, they finally reached their destination on March 5th, New Caledonia, a French-held island 750 miles east of Australia. It was here they met their new aircraft. As the massive wooden crates were unloaded at the docks, the mystery was solved. Inside were 45 P-400s and 2 P-39s, the American designation for the same basic plane. These were the very machines the British had rejected. Most of the pilots had never seen one before, let alone flown one. The nightmare began immediately. There were no assembly manuals. The oxygen systems designed for British equipment were incompatible with American masks, rendering them useless. Their first challenge was simply moving the 10,000-pound crates 35 kilometers down rough, muddy roads to a freshly carved airstrip at Tontuta. It was a grueling 8-hour one-way trip for each crate. Under the direction of Master Sergeant Robert Foy, the senior mechanic, the ground crews began the impossible task of assembly. They were plagued by tropical rain, relentless mosquito swarms, and a rising tide of disease from poor sanitation. They improvised assembly rigs from scrap wood. They discovered that vital parts, like propellers, were missing from some crates. Worse, they found bizarre factory errors. One plane's wiring was so crossed that hitting the switch for the flaps caused the landing gear to retract. It was a clear sign of a rushed wartime production line. Yet, through sheer grit and ingenuity, they persevered. Morale against all odds remained high. They were finally getting their hands on a modern fighter, and they were determined to make it fly. On March 28th, D.D. Brannan and John Thompson took the first P-400 up for a successful test flight over the island. The Fighting Cocks, as they now called themselves, were in business. They spent the spring and summer of 1942 patrolling the skies over New Caledonia, training their green pilots, and waiting for the war to find them. It wouldn't be long. The turning point for the 67th Fighter Squadron and for the entire Pacific War was an event that happened hundreds of miles away. In early August 1942, American reconnaissance planes flying over the Solomon Islands spotted it, a new, nearly completed Japanese airfield on the island of Guadalcanal. This was a strategic dagger aimed at the heart of the Allied supply line to Australia. From this base, Japanese bombers could sever the lifeline, isolating Australia and allowing Japan to consolidate its vast Pacific empire. The island had to be taken, and it had to be taken now. On August 7th, the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, stormed ashore. They quickly seized the unfinished airfield, renaming it Henderson Field. But the Japanese counterattack was swift and savage. In a disastrous naval engagement known as the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese Navy sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, forcing the American naval commanders to withdraw their transport ships. The Marines were left stranded. They had less than half their equipment, a few days' worth of food, and minimal ammunition. Japan now owned the sea and the sky around Guadalcanal. Vandegrift's only hope was Henderson Field. It was their lifeline. On August 20th, a small escort carrier managed to deliver the first planes of what would become the legendary Cactus Air Force 19. Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 12 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers. 2 days later, on August 22nd, came the Army's contribution. The Marines in their foxholes looked up to see 5 long-nosed fighters circling to land. Cheers erupted when they saw the U.S. Army markings. Reinforcements had arrived. Captain D.D. Brannan led the first flight of 5 P-400s from the 67th Fighter Squadron onto the dusty, shell-pocked runway. Their journey had been a harrowing, island-hopping flight over 500 miles of open ocean, escorted by B-17s carrying life rafts in case one of the single-engine fighters had to ditch. The reality of their new home set in immediately. The front lines were less than a mile away. Gunfire was a constant, ambient noise. Their headquarters was a rundown shack called the Pagoda. And they were introduced to the daily ritual of Tojo time. Every day around noon, a black flag was raised, signaling the approach of Japanese bombers from their massive base at Rabaul. The pilots of the 67th, eager to prove their worth, thought this was their moment. They had come to fight. The disillusionment was immediate and total. The very next day, as the black flag went up and bombs began to fall, Brannan managed to get airborne. The Marine Wildcats, tough and reliable, climbed high to meet the bombers. The P-400 struggled to gain altitude, their engines wheezing in the thin air. The Wildcats did the work, tearing into the Japanese formations. Brannan managed to damage a Zero, scoring the squadron's first kill, but it was a hollow victory. They were too slow, too low. On August 29th, the humiliation was complete. 12 P-400s scrambled to intercept a high-flying bomber raid. They clawed their way to 14,000 feet, circling uselessly, watching as the Marine Wildcats, thousands of feet above them, engaged the enemy. They were spectators at their own battle. They could do nothing but fly in circles and wait for the all clear, only to return and find their airfield cratered and burning. The next day, they tried to intercept a group of enemy dive bombers. This time, they were met by a swarm of the legendary Mitsubishi Zeros. The result was a massacre. The nimble Zeros, the undisputed masters of the dogfight, flew circles around the heavy, unmaneuverable Airacobras. 4 P-400s were shot down. 2 more limped back, shot to pieces. In a single engagement, their effective strength was shattered. The verdict from the Marine leadership was scathing. General Vandegrift wrote in his diary that the P-400 was nearly useless and begged his superiors not to send him any more. The perception spread that the Army pilots were avoiding combat. The final insult came from headquarters. A new standing order was issued. Whenever the black flag for an air raid was raised, the P-400s were to take off and fly out to sea on reconnaissance missions until the raid was over. The official purpose was to save the precious aircraft from being destroyed on the ground. But the pilots of the 67th knew what it really was. They had a different name for it. Fleeing. They, who had crossed an ocean to fight, were now ordered to run away every day. Morale hit rock bottom. They were a fighter squadron with a plane that couldn't fight, stranded on an island at the end of the world, held in contempt by the very men they had come to support. This was the inciting incident, the moment the myth of the Airacobra as a glorious fighter died, and the reality of it as a failure was brutally confirmed. This is where our story pivots. This is the moment where desperation becomes the mother of invention. For the men of the 67th, being relegated to fleeing was a professional and personal humiliation. But it was in this rock-bottom moment that a new possibility began to emerge. The pilots, and crucially their ground crews, knew the plane better than any theorist or general thousands of miles away. They knew its weaknesses, but they also knew its strange, unconventional strengths. The autopsy of the Airacobra's failure reveals the secret to its eventual, stunning success. First, let's re-examine that bizarre mid-engine design. While it created a poor center of gravity for high-altitude acrobatics, it did something else. It created an incredibly stable, steady gun platform. With no engine blocking the view, the pilot had a panoramic vista over the nose, perfect for spotting and engaging targets on the ground. The tricycle landing gear, a liability on rough, makeshift strips, also contributed to this stability. The plane was built like a rock. Second, the armament. That massive nose-mounted cannon, either the 20mm on the P-400 or the tank-busting 37mm on the P-39, was ill-suited for the split-second deflection shooting of a dogfight. But against a stationary or slow-moving ground target, a supply barge, a machine gun nest, a column of troops, it was devastating. It was a sniper rifle in a world of shotguns. Combined with the 250 caliber machine guns also mounted in the nose, all firing directly forward without the need for convergence, the Airacobra could focus an astonishing amount of firepower on a single point. Third, the construction. To protect the pilot from that long drive shaft, and to support the weight of the central engine, the Airacobra was built tough. It was heavier than a Zero and had significantly more armor plating around the cockpit and engine. This weight made it sluggish at altitude, but at treetop level, it meant the plane could absorb a surprising amount of small arms fire and shrapnel and still bring its pilot home. A Zero, built for lightness and agility, would disintegrate under similar punishment. The Airacobra was not a fighter. It was a ground attack aircraft that hadn't been invented yet, and on Guadalcanal, an island where the front line was a stone's throw from the runway, there was a desperate need for exactly that. The ripple effect of this realization began slowly. In early September, the P-400s were moved to a new, even rougher landing strip called Fighter 1, known colloquially as the cow pasture. Their mission officially changed. On September 2nd, a recently promoted Major D.D. Brannan led 4 P-400s, each carrying a 500-pound bomb, on a mission to strike Japanese supply barges near the village of Tasimboko. After dropping their bombs, they did something new. They turned back, descended to treetop level, and strafed the Japanese troops massed on the shore. They returned to base, rearmed, refueled, and went back out again 2 hours later. This became the new routine. The fleeing missions were over. The pilots of the 67th became the island's fire brigade. They flew from sunrise to sunset, sometimes 5 or more missions a day. They hunted the barges of the Tokyo Express. They scouted enemy positions. Most importantly, they provided on-call, close air support for the beleaguered Marines. The same pilots who had been scorned a week earlier were now a welcome sight. Their distinctive engine sound, a symbol of hope. The ingenuity of the ground crews was legendary. They kept the battered planes flying with scavenged parts and sheer willpower. One badly damaged Airacobra was completely rebuilt using the tail section from a wrecked P-39. To balance the new propeller, mechanics melted lead from bullets and poured it into the hollow prop hub. This hybrid plane, nicknamed the Resurrection, flew combat missions for months. They even created improvised bombs out of naval depth charges wrapped in chains. This transformation, from humiliated failure to indispensable weapon, culminated in the Battle of Edson's Ridge. By September 12th, Major General Kawaguchi's elite Japanese brigade was in position to deliver the knockout blow. Naval bombardments and air raids intensified. During one, a bomb exploded just 50 feet from Major Brannan's command bunker, wounding him badly enough that he had to be evacuated. Captain John Thompson, the confident Oregonian, took command. On the night of the 13th, the main Japanese assault began. They slammed into Edson's Marines, pushing them back across the ridge in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. By 3:00 a.m. on the 14th, the situation was critical. Edson had committed his last reserves. The line was about to break. If the ridge fell, Henderson Field would be next, and the island would be lost. This was the moment Captain Thompson was awakened and summoned to the command post. This was the moment the desperate Marine officer showed him the map and begged for help. Thompson knew what he had to do. As dawn broke, he and 2 of his lieutenants, B.E. Davis and Brian Brown, took off from the cow pasture. They had only 3 operational Airacobras. They flew low, hugging the jungle canopy. As they cleared the trees, they saw it. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed, massing in a clearing for the final charge against the exhausted Marines. Thompson dove first. He didn't fire in bursts. He held the trigger down, pouring a solid stream of 20-millimeter cannon shells and 50-caliber bullets into the heart of the formation. Davis and Brown followed, their own cannons tearing the Japanese lines apart. The attack was suicidal. They were flying so low, they were targeted by everything the Japanese had. Brown's plane was hit, and he was forced to glide back to the field without power. Thompson's aircraft was also damaged, but Davis, seeing the impact they were having, turned back for another pass, and another, firing until his ammunition was completely gone. Their desperate 10-minute attack shattered the Japanese offensive. It broke their momentum, buying the crucial minutes Edson's Marines needed to regroup and counterattack. When the sun fully rose, the ridge was littered with the bodies of hundreds of Japanese soldiers, many of them cut down by the Airacobras. The battle was won. Later that day, a humbled General Vandegrift found Thompson. He told him, "The newspapers won't cover it, but your small group of P-400s saved Guadalcanal today." As a token of his gratitude, he handed the army captain a rare bottle of scotch. The myth of the useless P-400 had died on the slopes of Edson's Ridge, replaced by the legend of the Yankee Jagdstaffel, a mispronounced German term the Marines had affectionately given them. The failed fighter had become the island's savior. The Battle of Edson's Ridge was the climax, but not the end of the story for the 67th Fighter Squadron. The fighting for Guadalcanal would rage for another 4 brutal months. The Japanese would launch 2 more massive offensives, pouring thousands more troops onto the island. The men of the 67th continued their grueling routine, surviving on a diet of canned sardines, battling malaria and typhus, and flying their patched-up Airacobras into the teeth of the enemy. As American strength on the island grew, the role of the Cactus Air Force evolved. New pilots arrived. Upgraded P-39 models with better oxygen systems replaced the old, rejected P-400s. In November, during the final great naval battle for the island, aircraft from the 67th flew alongside Navy and Marine squadrons to attack the Japanese battleship Hiei. Riddled by bombs, torpedoes, and cannon fire from dozens of aircraft, the mighty warship was sunk, a symbol of Japan's broken hopes in the Solomons. The legacy of the P-400 on Guadalcanal is not one of air-to-air victories or glamorous dogfights. It is a legacy of adaptation, of finding value where others saw only failure. The experience proved a vital lesson for American air power, the importance of dedicated ground attack aircraft. The thunderous strafing runs of the P-47 Thunderbolt in Europe, and the tank-busting prowess of the A-10 Warthog decades later, all owe a small debt to the improvised, desperate missions flown by the 67th. Interestingly, the Soviet Union would become the largest operator of the Airacobra, receiving thousands under Lend-Lease. They loved it for the exact same reasons it succeeded on Guadalcanal. Its heavy armament and toughness made it a superb low-altitude tank killer on the Eastern Front. One nation's failure was another's perfect weapon. The ultimate lesson of the P-400 Airacobra is a timeless one. It's a story that transcends military hardware. It teaches us that circumstances define purpose, that ingenuity born of desperation can be more powerful than the most advanced technology. The heroes of this story are not the engineers at Bell Aircraft, but the mechanics like Robert Foy, who built miracles out of wreckage, and the pilots like John Thompson, who flew a flawed machine with unflinching courage, discovering a new way to fight when the old way failed. They remind us that history is not just shaped by the best-laid plans and the finest equipment, but by the grit of ordinary people in extraordinary situations, who refuse to fail, and in doing so, change the course of the world. History is filled with these stories of overlooked weapons and unsung heroes. The real narrative of our past is often found not in the official histories, but in the mud-stained diaries and forgotten after-action reports. What other failed technologies do you think secretly saved the day? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe these are the stories that deserve to be told, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to join us on our next journey into the past.